talk about intergenerational justice. I think the clock is already going off. It really wasn't 10 minutes yet, right? And in particular, to talk about the work that I have done in the last few years with an even larger team, an international team, on a project called the Climate Legacy Initiative. Why do this? Well, the case has been made throughout the day, especially given the focus and your orange shirts, the sea of orange shirts in front of us. I don't really think I'm going to be around in 2050, but I can calculate and tell you that my oldest son, who was my law school baby, is going to be, I did the calculation, he's going to be 59, which is hard to imagine. And my younger child, my baby, who was my clerkship baby, will be 55. And so that's one way of measuring why I should care about intergenerational justice, but we're all here in a more abstract form, aren't we, to talk about sustainability. And talking about intergenerational equity and justice is another way of talking about sustainability. The way our project went about it was to say, look, let's look at the law how it stands now, not climate change law, because right now we're in this pickle in part because we don't have effective laws to regulate climate change. But let's instead look at law overall and say, how does it implicitly or explicitly recognize intergenerational accountability? What structures are already embedded in the law, and how can we use them to scaffold better regulation of climate change, in particular better regulation, so as to attain intergenerational equity? Okay? We hear a lot of rhetoric about caring about future generations. The opening meeting on Monday, I wasn't here for it, I was still in Paris, but I heard about the remarks about our children and grandchildren. I heard about the children's chorus, and pretty much every session I've been in thus far has talked about why we should care in terms of children and grandchildren. But more abstractly, I think the reason we should care is because, as I was saying earlier about sustainability, we have a long history of embedded in morality and philosophy about how, whether it's because we want to make sure that we continue with the human species, we want to make sure that we honor the legacy that was given to us in the past and that we feel inclined or required to pass on. It could be because we believe in the social contract, and that extends beyond just the people with whom we're sitting in this room or sharing this planet right now, but with the future and with past. Regardless of how you embed it or see it through a moral lens, I'd argue to you that the law already recognizes, at least the law that I know in the United States as well as in various other countries, both civil and common law, and in some international law, recognizes a sense of equity. So let me talk to you, though, about 3 principles that I think you can use when you're analyzing how does a particular law recognize or act on, or maybe it's a weird word, but operationalize intergenerational equity or justice. Edith Brown Weiss, I don't know if any of you have heard of her, but she is, at least in the United States, a very well-known international environmental law professor. And she wrote a seminal book, which I really encourage you to read. It's not very long, in 1989, called In Fairness to Future Generations. And so this is not my original work, nor my project's work, but we took her principles and then went out and saw, or tried to see, how they were applied, how they were used in real operational day-to-day law. She has 3 principles. 1, that each generation, when you're thinking about your legacy, and this is not just environmental legacy, we could certainly talk about this in terms of national debt, right? It's things that one generation creates, puts up in the sky, or spends too much in one generation, and then the harm of which, the results of which, vests in a different generation. And most law just cannot regulate over that long of a temporal span. Okay? But she said that what we really need to do is be able to do that, and a framework for doing it is say we should look for 3 things in laws so that we can ensure intergenerational equity. One is that the law should preserve options, and in the area or arena of environmental law, she said it should preserve, environmental law should preserve the diversity of choice, and not diminish the range of natural resources. So the idea that there's a variety of things, right, in diversity and biodiversity, and that we should look at our legacy in terms of preserving options to future generations rather than prescribing them by current generations. Second, we should preserve quality. And she says, fundamentally, we should pass on the world the way it was given to us, or, in our case right now, your case in particular, be obliged to improve it while passing it on. And then third, providing equal access to public resources. And there's one where she says that's both an intergenerational obligation as well as intra, which is something I'm not going to talk about today. There's plenty to talk about there, but I'm going to focus on inter. So I'm going to go through these quickly, although they're very pretty pictures. I'll stay on the windmills because I love your windmills here. I'm sorry, turbines. Let me give you some examples. Let's see, I don't think I have them here yet. How does this happen now? How much time do I have? Do you know? Okay, I want to figure out how few examples I can give you to have the biggest punch here, right? So first of all, I'll preface it with, this is the policy paper the Climate Legacy Initiative produced last year. There are copies of it on the table over there. It's very slim to entice you to read it, but we also include a CD in the back, which has all of the background paper. So this is the product, a synthesis product, if you will. Not the fourth synthesis, this was our first synthesis of the work of many scholars across the country, of the United States and some internationally. So let me give you a few examples to hopefully entice you to read this more. So when we think about enhancing or preserving the diversity of options, I think of a couple of laws and how the law could do it. One is constitutionally. In the United States, we have more than one state, but Montana is the one that comes to mind, state constitutional provisions that explicitly recognize a constitutional obligation to ensure, well, ensure's a little too strong. Let me give you the language itself, because I think it might interest you. The Montana State Constitution says the state and each person, so not just the state obligation, each person, shall maintain and improve a clean and healthful environment in Montana for present and future generations. It's written in the Constitution. Moreover, I point to Montana because it's actually been used before the Montana Supreme Court twice, successfully, to put it into practice, to actually stop development in some areas and to ground it in a sense of sustainability and accountability to future generations. Some good news from the United States for once, I guess. We tend to do things at a state level, or at least have been during the last couple administrations. And at a different level, I'd point to at least the preamble of what was a seminal environmental law in the 1970s in the United States. We call it NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. And it set up a system of review, basically governmental reviews, of decisions that would impact the environment. And clearly, you can hear in the preamble that we must create and maintain conditions under which man, hopefully woman too, and nature can exist in productive harmony and fulfill the social, economic, and other requirements of present and future generations. It set out the system, and I would argue to you, to preserve access, because it actually gave the right to review and for citizens to push that right of review. So there's an example of where that Brown-Weiss's principle of access could be said to be operationalized here through the law. It's not perfect, and in fact, one of the recommendations in this policy report, or this policy paper, is to actually enact something called NELA, the National Environmental Legacy Act, which would actually establish a substantive standard for what the legacy should be versus procedural requirements. Let me point to two other things, and then I'll close. And when I say things, of course, I'm thinking things in my area of work, laws. I would, let's see. Well, let me do two other things. One, the courts. Of course, you think of the United States, or I shouldn't say of course, I suspect you think of the United States as being a very litigious country, and we certainly produce enough able lawyers every year and have plenty of courts to go to. But the Australians in the last 4 years, are there any Australians here perhaps? All right. Well, I did a little work following the work of several of the trial and appellate courts that have really pushed the envelope, I think, of your environmental law, which was not a climate change law, and I know your National Assembly just recently shot down the carbon trading scheme, right? So I feel your pain. But the courts have really been taking a step forward. And in particular, there was a case of where a coal mining facility went ahead and got its permits, and everybody said it's hunky-dory. But then some courageous young people, student as I recall, joined up with an organization, brought a suit, and said, that's not good enough. You actually, court, have to take into account the impact of the burning of that coal. And not just in Australia, but where it's being sold. That's revolutionary, because usually we lawyers tend to think in a kind of cramped style within our jurisdictions. So I would give kudos to the Australian courts there. Finally, I'd like to point out one administrative example, or a structural one, a parliamentary one. I know that the Israeli Knesset, I think for about 5 years, from 2002 to about 2007, created an institution called the Commission for Future Generations. Its role was to review every piece of legislation and advise the Knesset on how to proceed with respect to its impact on future generations. That law sunsetted, but there now is a commissioner of a similar ilk in Hungary. So those are techniques of how to use the law to do this. I can see from rumbling of my co-panelists that it's time to cede the microphone. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. I recognize the law isn't the only way to do it, right? But it's one way, and I would encourage you to think about it in your future. Thanks.